What would you do if the person you trusted most became your worst nightmare? Sarah Collins thought she had it all, a billionaire husband and a baby on the way. But behind the golden facade lay psychological manipulation and financial control that would shock even hardened observers. Tonight, at Manhattan's most exclusive gala, a spilled glass of wine will trigger events exposing one man's monstrous behavior. This billionaire thought he was untouchable. He's about to discover some survivors fight back. Hit like if you're ready to see justice served, and subscribe for more empowering stories. The Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom sparkled like a jeweled crown under the crystal chandeliers. Manhattan's elite mingled in their $1,000 gowns and tailored tuxedos, champagne glasses catching the light as they discussed their latest acquisitions and charitable tax write-offs. The annual Children's Hospital benefit had drawn the usual suspects: tech moguls, Wall Street titans, real estate empires, and old money dynasties. Sarah Collins stood near the marble pillar, her hand resting protectively on her 7-month pregnant belly. Her navy maternity dress was elegant but simple, a stark contrast to the designer couture surrounding her. At 32, she had once commanded boardrooms as a marketing executive. Now she felt invisible, a shadow in her husband's gleaming world. Across the ballroom, Marcus Collins held court with a circle of admirers. At 38, he commanded attention effortlessly. His tech company, Collins Innovations, had revolutionized cloud security and made him worth $2 billion. His perfectly styled dark hair and custom Italian suit screamed success. But Sarah knew the man beneath the facade. "Marcus, you must tell us about the new government contracts," gushed Margaret Westfield, the mayor's wife. "The papers say Collins Innovations is expanding to Europe." Marcus smiled, that practiced smile Sarah had learned to fear. "We're always looking for new opportunities to serve our clients," he said smoothly. His eyes found Sarah across the room, and his expression hardened for just a moment before returning to its charming mask. Standing beside Marcus was Jessica Hart, his 28-year-old vice president of marketing. Her red dress hugged every curve, and her laugh was just a touch too loud, too intimate. Sarah watched as Jessica's hand brushed Marcus's arm, watched as he leaned in to whisper something that made her giggle. Everyone could see what was happening. Everyone pretended they couldn't. Sarah moved toward the refreshment table, trying to disappear into the crowd. A waiter with a full tray of wine glasses approached from her left, just as another guest stepped backward into her path. Sarah stumbled slightly, her pregnant body off balance, and bumped into the waiter's elbow. Time slowed as red wine arced through the air, splashing across Marcus's pristine white shirt and $5,000 Tom Ford jacket. The conversations around them died. Heads turned. Cameras hidden in phones began recording. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, then something far more dangerous: calculated fury. He set down his champagne glass with deliberate precision. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom, "how wonderfully typical of you to make such a scene." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "Marcus, I'm so sorry. It was an accident." An accident. Marcus stepped closer, his voice rising just enough for nearby guests to hear every word. "You've been clumsy and careless for months. First, you can barely walk without waddling. Now you're destroying other people's property because you can't control your own body." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Sarah felt her face burn with humiliation as every eye in the ballroom focused on them. This was worse than a physical blow. This was surgical destruction of her dignity in front of 200 of the most powerful people in New York. "Maybe if you hadn't let yourself go so completely," Marcus continued, his tone conversational, but his words like razor blades, "you'd still have some sense of grace, But I suppose that's what happens when a woman stops caring about herself or her husband. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but no one intervened. No one spoke up. They were witnessing a public execution, and they all just stood there filming it with their phones. Sarah's vision blurred with tears, but she couldn't break down. Not here, not in front of everyone. She wrapped her arms around her belly, protecting the only thing in her life that was still pure. From across the ballroom, a man watched the scene unfold with steely gray eyes. Daniel Blackstone stood 6 feet 3 inches tall, his presence commanding even in silence. Unlike the others, he wasn't filming or whispering to his neighbors. His jaw was clenched, his hands balled into fists at his sides. He knew exactly what he was witnessing, and he was done watching it happen. Sarah fled to the women's restroom, her heels clicking against marble floors as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. She locked herself in the handicapped stall and sank onto the toilet seat, her body shaking with humiliation and rage. How had she become this person 5 years ago? She'd been Sarah Mitchell, a successful marketing executive with her own apartment, her own car, her own dreams. She'd met Marcus at a tech conference where she was presenting on digital consumer behavior. He'd been charming, attentive, overwhelming in his pursuit. The courtship had been a whirlwind of expensive dinners, weekend trips to his house in the Hamptons, and promises of a life where she'd never have to worry about money again. "Let me take care of you," he'd whispered during their engagement. "You're too brilliant to waste your talents working for other people." She'd given up her job after the wedding, thinking she'd start her own consulting firm, but Marcus always had reasons why it wasn't the right time. First, they were renovating the penthouse. Then he was launching a new product and needed her support at home. When she got pregnant, he'd insisted the stress would be bad for the baby. Now she sat in a bathroom stall, 7 months pregnant and completely dependent on a man who publicly humiliated her for sport. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Car is waiting outside. We're leaving. Don't embarrass me further by making a scene." Sarah steadied herself and walked back into the ballroom. The conversations had resumed, but she felt the weight of stares and whispered comments following her. Marcus stood by the exit with Jessica, his arm around his employee's waist as he spoke to a group of investors. "Ah, there she is," Marcus said as Sarah approached. "Gentlemen, my wife Sarah. You'll have to excuse her appearance. Pregnancy has been quite challenging for her." The men nodded politely, their discomfort obvious. One of them, an older man with kind eyes, started to say something supportive, but Marcus cut him off. "Sarah, wait in the car. I have business to finish." As Sarah walked toward the exit, she passed Daniel Blackstone. Their eyes met for just a moment, and she saw something there: recognition, sympathy, and something else. Something that looked like determination. The ride home was silent except for the hum of the Mercedes engine. Marcus sat beside her, scrolling through his phone, occasionally showing Jessica something that made her laugh. Sarah stared out the window at the city lights, trying to disappear inside herself. Their penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a building Marcus owned on 5th Avenue. The view of Central Park was stunning, but Sarah felt like she was looking out from a prison cell. As soon as they entered, Marcus's mask dropped completely. $3 million, he said, hanging up his ruined jacket. $3 million in potential contracts you may have just cost me tonight. Marcus, it was an accident. Was it? He stepped closer, his voice dropping to the dangerous tone she'd learned to fear. Because from where I stood, it looked like you were trying to sabotage me. Again. Sarah's heart pounded. That's not true, and you know it. Do I? Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. Social media was already buzzing with videos of the incident. Look at this. Tech billionaire's wife causes scene at charity gala. Marcus Collins, humiliated by clumsy spouse. Do you see what you've done? He grabbed her wrist, not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to control. You're going to fix this. Tomorrow, you're going to call every major newspaper and explain that you've been having balance issues due to your pregnancy. You're going to apologize publicly for disrupting the charity event. I won't do that. Marcus's grip tightened. Yes, you will. Because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows about your little breakdown last month. The one where you threatened to hurt yourself. I have it all recorded. Sarah. Every hysterical word. Sarah's blood turned cold. She remembered that night she'd been crying after discovering one of his affairs, talking about how she sometimes wished she could just disappear. She'd never threatened suicide, but Marcus could edit the recording to make it sound like she had. You wouldn't. Try me. He released her wrist and straightened his shirt. Oh. And Sarah, pack a bag for Jessica. She'll be staying in the guest room for a few days. We have some projects to work on. As Marcus walked away, Sarah felt the walls of her golden cage closing in tighter than ever. But what she didn't know was that across the city, Daniel Blackstone was making phone calls of his own, and the game was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. Daniel Blackstone sat in his corner office on the 52nd floor of the Blackstone Tower, Manhattan sprawling beneath him like a chessboard. Unlike Marcus Collins's flashy displays of wealth, Daniel's success was quieter but deeper. His private equity firm controlled interests in everything from renewable energy to biotechnology, built on a foundation of patience, strategy, and an ironclad moral code. He'd made his first million by 25, not through inheritance or luck, but by understanding that information was the ultimate currency. Now, at 42, he was worth $8 billion and had learned that money without purpose was just numbers on a screen. Tonight, those numbers would serve a purpose. Daniel opened a secure laptop and began typing. Within minutes, he'd accessed financial databases that would take most people years to penetrate. Marcus Collins might have fooled the world with his family man image, but digital footprints didn't lie. The first anomaly appeared within an hour. Collins Innovations had been quietly moving money through a network of shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Not unusual for tech companies, but the timing was interesting. The transfers had accelerated in the past 6 months, coinciding with Sarah's pregnancy. Daniel's phone buzzed. Mr. Blackstone. His assistant, Rebecca, sounded concerned despite the late hour. I have the background report you requested on Marcus Collins. Send it to my secure server. The file was thorough. Marcus Collins had a pattern, and it wasn't pretty. 3 previous relationships with successful women, all of whom had mysteriously lost their careers and independence after getting involved with him. One had suffered a nervous breakdown. Another had vanished from New York society entirely. The third had died in a car accident 6 months after their messy breakup. Daniel's jaw tightened as he read deeper. Collins used a playbook: isolate, control, humiliate, discard. The only difference with Sarah was the pregnancy, which gave him a longer-term hold over his victim. But there was something else in the file that made Daniel's blood run cold. A name he recognized: Emma Blackstone, his sister. 10 years ago, Emma had been a rising star in biotechnology, brilliant and ambitious. She dated Marcus Collins for 8 months before their relationship ended in her attempting suicide. Daniel had never known the details. Emma had been too ashamed to tell him what Marcus had done to her. She'd recovered, started over, but she'd never been the same. Emma had died 3 years ago in that car accident, and Daniel had always suspected it wasn't really an accident. Now he was certain. His secure phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he recognized: Sarah Collins. Mrs. Collins. Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. Mr. Blackstone, I got your number from the charity event directory. I need to ask you something. I'm listening. Tonight, when he was saying those things about me, you looked angry, not uncomfortable like everyone else. Angry. Why? Daniel measured his words carefully. Because what I witnessed tonight was abuse. Mrs. Collins. And I don't tolerate abuse. Silence stretched between them before Sarah spoke again. He's going to destroy me. I can feel it. He's been building up to something for months, and I don't know how to stop it. What if I told you that you don't have to stop it alone? I'd ask why a billionaire would want to help someone like me. Daniel closed his eyes, seeing Emma's face in his memory. Because someone I loved was hurt by the same man, and I failed to protect her. Sarah's intake of breath was audible. Who? My sister Emma. She dated Marcus 10 years ago. She never recovered from what he did to her. Emma Blackstone, the biotech researcher who died in that car crash. You knew her. I read about her work when I was researching Marcus's business connections. She was brilliant. The articles about her death said she was working on something revolutionary before she died. Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. She was working on exposing Marcus's financial crimes. She'd discovered he was stealing intellectual property from startups before acquiring them. She died 2 days before she was supposed to testify to the SEC. The pieces clicked into place for Sarah. It wasn't an accident. No, it wasn't. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger. What do you want from me, Mr. Blackstone? I want to help you get free, and in doing so, I want to make sure Marcus Collins never hurts another woman again. He'll fight back. He has lawyers, money, connections. So do I. But more importantly, I have something he doesn't. What's that? Daniel looked at Emma's photo on his desk. Time, patience, and a very long memory. After ending the call, Daniel opened another file on his computer. This one contained everything he'd been gathering on Marcus Collins for 3 years, ever since Emma's death. Financial records, witness statements, digital forensics, medical reports. Marcus thought he was untouchable because he'd always chosen isolated victims with no resources to fight back. But this time was different. This time, he'd made the mistake of targeting someone who had a protector with unlimited resources and a personal vendetta. The game was just beginning. Sarah woke to find Marcus already gone from their bedroom. Jessica's laughter echoed from the kitchen, where she was apparently making breakfast in Sarah's home, wearing Sarah's silk robe. The casual intimacy of it made Sarah's stomach turn. She dressed quietly and was heading for the door when Marcus intercepted her in the foyer. Where are you going? Doctor's appointment. It wasn't a lie she had a routine checkup scheduled. Jessica will drive you. Sarah's heart sank. The last thing she wanted was to be trapped in a car with her husband's mistress. I can take a taxi. Jessica is driving you. Marcus's tone brooked no argument. She needs to understand how to handle things when the baby comes. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Marcus was planning for Jessica to be part of their child's life. He was already replacing her as a mother. The drive to Dr. Martinez's office was excruciating. Jessica chatted cheerfully about nursery decorations and baby names, speaking as if she were the expectant mother instead of the other woman. Marcus thinks we should go with something classic, Jessica said, checking her lipstick in the mirror. Like Marcus Jr., or maybe Alexander. Sarah couldn't keep the edge from her voice. Jessica's smile turned sharp. Well, someone needs to help him make the important decisions. You've been so emotional lately. At the doctor's office, Sarah sat in the waiting room trying to process what was happening. Jessica had come inside with her, claiming Marcus wanted updates on the baby's health. The nurse called Sarah's name, and Jessica stood up too. "I'm sorry," Dr. Martinez said gently when they entered the examination room. "Are you family?" "She's my husband's business associate," Sarah said quickly. "Then I'm afraid she'll need to wait outside. Patient privacy laws. You understand?" Once they were alone, Dr. Martinez's expression grew concerned. "Sarah, your blood pressure is elevated, and you've lost weight since your last visit. That's unusual for this stage of pregnancy. Are you under stress?" Sarah wanted to break down, to tell Dr. Martinez everything. But Marcus had made it clear what would happen if she spoke to anyone about their marriage. He had recordings, witnesses, evidence that would paint her as unstable. He could have her declared unfit and take custody of the baby. "Just normal pregnancy stress," Sarah lied. Dr. Martinez didn't look convinced, but she completed the examination. "The baby looks healthy, but I'm concerned about you. If you need to talk to someone, I can recommend I'm fine." After the appointment, Jessica drove them to lunch at Marcus's favorite restaurant. Sarah picked at her salad while Jessica ordered wine and chatted about the morning. "The doctor seems nice," Jessica said. "A little nosy, though. All those questions about stress and home life." Sarah's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Jessica had been listening at the door. "Marcus will be interested to hear about your conversation," Jessica continued with false sweetness. "Especially the part where she offered to recommend a psychiatrist." That evening, Marcus confronted Sarah in their bedroom. He held his phone, and Sarah could see a recording app open on the screen. "Jessica told me about your doctor's visit. She's concerned about your mental state." "There's nothing wrong with my mental state." "Isn't there?" Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used when he was about to destroy her. "You've been having crying fits, mood swings, paranoid thoughts about my relationship with Jessica. Even your doctor thinks you need psychiatric help." Sarah realized with growing horror that this had all been planned. The appointment, Jessica's presence, even the conversation with Dr. Martinez, it was all being used to build a case against her. "I want you to see Dr. Harrison," Marcus continued. "He specializes in pregnancy-related mental health issues. I don't need a psychiatrist. That's not your decision to make anymore." Marcus stood and walked to his dresser. "I've already made the appointment. Dr. Harrison is a family friend. He'll make sure you get the help you need." The threat was clear. Dr. Harrison would diagnose whatever Marcus wanted him to diagnose. The recordings, the witnesses, the medical opinions. Marcus was building an airtight case to prove Sarah was an unfit mother. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Coffee shop on 73rd and Lexington. 1 hour. Come alone. DB. Daniel Blackstone." Sarah looked at Marcus, who was now in the bathroom running water for a shower. Jessica's laughter came from the living room where she was apparently making herself at home for another evening. Sarah made her decision. She grabbed her coat and purse, slipping out of the penthouse while Marcus was distracted. The coffee shop was small and crowded, providing perfect cover for a clandestine meeting. Daniel sat in a corner booth, his presence somehow both commanding and reassuring. He stood as she approached, pulling out her chair. "Thank you for coming." Sarah sat down, her hands shaking. "He's planning to have me declared mentally incompetent. He's building a case to take my baby." "I know." Daniel slid a manila folder across the table. "But so are we. Inside the folder were documents Sarah had never seen before, financial records showing Marcus's offshore accounts, transcripts of phone calls between Marcus and his lawyer discussing strategy for the custody case, and photos of Marcus with multiple women over the years. How did you get these? The same way Marcus gets his ammunition, through surveillance and digital forensics. The difference is, I'm using these tools to expose the truth, not manufacture lies. Sarah studied the documents, hope and terror warring in her chest. If he finds out I'm meeting with you, he won't. But Sarah, I need you to understand something. If we do this, there's no going back. Marcus will use every weapon he has against you. Are you prepared for that? Sarah thought about her baby, about the life she wanted to give her child, about the woman she used to be before Marcus systematically destroyed her confidence and independence. What do I need to do? Daniel's smile was grim but determined. First, we're going to make sure you're safe. Then we're going to give Marcus Collins a taste of his own medicine. Daniel's safe house was a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, unremarkable from the outside but equipped with state-of-the-art security systems. Sarah sat in the living room, overwhelmed by the events of the past 24 hours. She'd left the penthouse that morning under the pretense of going shopping, but instead, she'd met Daniel's security team at a predetermined location. They'd swept her for tracking devices, finding two, hidden in her purse and coat, then brought her to safety. Marcus will realize I'm gone soon, Sarah said, her hand protectively covering her belly. Let him. Daniel handed her a cup of herbal tea. We want him to panic. Panicked people make mistakes. The security team leader, a former FBI agent named Kate Morrison, entered the room carrying a laptop. We've confirmed the financial transfers. Marcus has been moving money out of joint accounts for 6 months, approximately $2.7 million total. Sarah gasped. That's nearly everything we had in savings. He's been planning this for a while, Daniel said grimly. The question is, what triggered the timeline? Kate pulled up another document. We found something interesting in his communications with Jessica Hart. 3 months ago, she told him she was pregnant. The world seemed to tilt around Sarah. Pregnant. The pregnancy was terminated 2 weeks later, but by then, Marcus had already started accelerating his exit strategy. He was preparing to divorce you and marry Jessica, using your supposed mental instability as grounds for full custody. Sarah felt sick. Everything made sense now: the increased cruelty, the public humiliation, the systematic isolation. Marcus had been preparing to discard her like he had his previous victims, but this time he wanted to keep the baby as his trophy. There's more, Kate continued. We traced the shell companies he's been using. They're not just hiding money, they're hiding intellectual property theft. Marcus has been stealing technology from smaller companies before acquiring them, then claiming the innovations as his own. Daniel's expression hardened. Just like he did to Emma's biotech startup. Sarah looked between them. Your sister was working for Marcus. She was working with him, developing revolutionary gene therapy techniques. When she discovered he was stealing her research to sell to pharmaceutical companies, she tried to expose him. That's when he started the psychological warfare. The pattern was becoming clear. Marcus was a predator who targeted brilliant, successful women, destroyed their confidence and independence, then stole their achievements for himself. We need to move carefully, Daniel said. Marcus has resources and connections. If we tip our hand too early... Sarah's phone rang, interrupting him. Marcus's name flashed on the screen. Answer it, Daniel instructed. Act normal. Sarah accepted the call, putting it on speaker. Marcus's voice filled the room, cold and controlled. Where are you? Sarah. I went to see a movie. I needed some air. Alone in your condition. His tone was deceptively concerned, but Sarah could hear the rage underneath. I'm worried about you, sweetheart. This kind of irresponsible behavior is exactly what Dr. Harrison warned me about. Sarah's blood chilled. What do you mean? I had to call him when I couldn't reach you. He's very concerned about your mental state, especially after Jessica told him about your paranoid delusions regarding our working relationship. The trap was closing. Marcus was creating a paper trail of Sarah's alleged instability, using her disappearance as evidence. Come home, Sarah. We need to talk about getting you the help you need. After she hung up, Daniel was already on his phone. We need to accelerate our timeline. Marcus is moving faster than we anticipated. Now, what does that mean? It means tomorrow morning. You're going to walk into the offices of the Securities and Exchange Commission and file a formal complaint against your husband. Sarah's heart hammered. He'll destroy me. He's going to try to destroy you anyway, but this time, you won't be facing him alone. That night, as Sarah lay in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar house, she felt her baby kick strongly against her ribs. She pressed her hand to the spot, whispering a promise. I'm going to fight for you, whatever it costs me. I'm going to make sure you have a better life than this. Outside her window, the city lights twinkled like stars. Somewhere across those lights, Marcus was probably planning his next move, confident that he held all the cards. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The SEC building in Manhattan was imposing, its gray stone facade radiating the weight of federal authority. Sarah sat in the waiting room, her hands folded over her pregnant belly, while Daniel spoke quietly with their lawyer. 3 days had passed since she disappeared from Marcus's penthouse. 3 days of increasingly frantic phone calls, threatening voicemails, and social media posts about his missing wife who was suffering from pregnancy-related depression. Now Marcus was about to discover where she'd really been. Mrs. Collins. A stern woman in her 50s appeared at the reception desk. I'm Director Walsh. We're ready for you. The conference room was filled with serious-faced investigators, financial analysts, and legal advisors. Sarah felt small under their scrutiny, but Daniel's presence beside her was reassuring. Mrs. Collins, Director Walsh began, you've made some serious allegations against your husband. Before we proceed, I need to make sure you understand the gravity of what you're claiming. Sarah straightened her shoulders. I understand. My husband has been systematically stealing intellectual property from smaller companies, hiding assets in offshore accounts, and using his position to manipulate financial markets. And you have evidence of these claims. Daniel slid a thick folder across the table. Financial records, recorded conversations, documentation of shell companies, and testimony from victims of Mr. Collins's previous schemes. For the next 3 hours, Sarah detailed everything she knew about Marcus's business practices. The investigators asked pointed questions, took notes, and exchanged meaningful glances. Finally, Director Walsh leaned back in her chair. Mrs. Collins, what you've provided is substantial, but investigating someone of Marcus Collins's stature will take time. Are you prepared for the backlash this will bring? Before Sarah could answer, her phone buzzed with an urgent notification, then another, and another. The news was breaking everywhere. Tech mogul's wife accuses him of financial crimes. Sarah Collins files complaint against billionaire husband. Collins Innovation stock plummets amid scandal. How is this public already? Sarah gasped. Daniel checked his phone grimly. Marcus just held a press conference. They rushed to a television in the lobby where Marcus's face filled the screen. He stood behind a podium flanked by lawyers and doctors. his expression the perfect mixture of concern and determination. "My wife Sarah is suffering from severe prenatal depression," Marcus was saying to a crowd of reporters. "She's been having paranoid delusions, making wild accusations, and I'm heartbroken to say that she's been manipulated by individuals who want to damage my company." Sarah watched in horror as her husband systematically destroyed her credibility in real time. Dr. Harrison, who's been treating Sarah, will confirm that she's been experiencing episodes of dissociation and paranoid thinking. This morning, she disappeared from our home and made these baseless accusations to federal investigators while in the midst of a severe psychological break. The reporters shouted questions, but Marcus held up his hand. "I ask for privacy during this difficult time as we work to get Sarah the help she needs. I love my wife, and I will not abandon her during her illness, even as she's being used as a weapon against me." Dr. Harrison stepped forward, his voice professionally concerned. "Pregnancy-related depression can cause severe symptoms including paranoia, delusions of persecution, and inability to distinguish reality from fantasy. Mrs. Collins is clearly in crisis and needs immediate psychiatric intervention." Sarah sank into a nearby chair as the full scope of Marcus's counterattack became clear. He'd turned her accusations into symptoms of mental illness, painted himself as the devoted husband, and positioned her as an unreliable witness who couldn't tell truth from delusion. "Brilliant," Daniel said quietly, and Sarah stared at him in shock. "Brilliant. He just destroyed my credibility." "No." Daniel's smile was sharp as a blade. "He just handed us exactly what we needed." Sarah didn't understand until they were back in the car and Daniel was making phone calls. His first call was to Kate Morrison. "It's time to release the recordings," he said. "What recordings?" Sarah asked. "The ones Marcus didn't know we were making during his press conference. Kate's been monitoring his communications for weeks. Every call to Dr. Harrison, every strategy session with his lawyers, every conversation with Jessica about their plan." Sarah's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You knew he would do this." "I was counting on it. Marcus's greatest weakness is his arrogance. He can't resist the grand gesture, the public performance. But while he was busy playing the concerned husband on television, he was also caught on tape coaching Dr. Harrison on what to say and coordinating with his legal team to have you committed." Daniel's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He read it and smiled grimly. "The SEC just executed search warrants on Collins Innovations offices and Marcus's personal assets. They're also issuing a warrant for his arrest on charges of securities fraud and witness intimidation." Witness intimidation. His press conference was designed to discredit a federal witness. That's a felony. But even as relief flooded through Sarah, she knew this was far from over. Marcus Collins was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and cornered predators were the most dangerous of all. Her phone rang. Marcus's number flashed on the screen, and this time when she answered, there was no pretense of concern in his voice. "You think you're clever, don't you? Sarah, you think you've won." Sarah looked at Daniel, who nodded encouragingly. The call was being recorded. "I think I've finally stopped being afraid of you." Marcus's laugh was cold and sharp. "You should be afraid, because I'm going to destroy you. Sarah, I'm going to take that baby, and I'm going to make sure you never see another day of happiness in your life." The line went dead, and Sarah realized that the real war was just beginning. 24 hours after Marcus's arrest, Sarah learned just how ruthless a cornered predator could be. She woke in the Brooklyn safe house to find her photo plastered across every tabloid and news website. The headlines were devastating. "Delusional wife destroys tech empire. Pregnant woman's mental break costs investors billions." The real victim, Marcus Collins, fights for his unborn child. But the articles weren't just attacking her credibility, they were attacking her character. Anonymous sources claimed she'd been having affairs, that she'd threatened suicide multiple times, that she'd been abusing prescription drugs. None of this is true, Sarah said, scrolling through the vicious stories on her phone. Of course not, Daniel replied grimly. But Marcus has had years to plant these stories, create these sources, manufacture this evidence. He's been planning for this possibility since the day he married you. Kate Morrison entered the room carrying a laptop. It gets worse. Marcus made bail an hour ago, and his first stop was the family court. He's filed for emergency custody of your baby, claiming you're a danger to yourself and the child. Sarah felt the world tilt around her. Can he do that? With the right judge and the right evidence. Yes, and Marcus has both. The evidence was overwhelming in its scope and creativity. Medical records showing Sarah's alleged psychiatric treatments, witness statements from household staff claiming she'd been erratic and violent, financial records suggesting she'd been stealing from Marcus's accounts to fund her own secret activities. How is this possible? Sarah whispered. Because Marcus has been building this case for months. Daniel explained. Every argument you had was recorded. Every moment of distress was documented. Every time you cried or seemed overwhelmed, he was creating evidence of your mental instability. The hearing was scheduled for that afternoon. Sarah sat in the family courtroom, 7 months pregnant and facing a judge who looked at her with obvious skepticism. Marcus sat across the aisle with his team of lawyers, his expression perfectly crafted to convey concerned confusion. Your Honor, Marcus's lead attorney began. My client is deeply concerned about his wife's mental state and the safety of their unborn child. Mrs. Collins has been exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior, including paranoid delusions about my client's business practices. The attorney presented their evidence, methodically recordings of Sarah crying hysterically, medical opinions from Dr. Harrison about her mental state, witness statements from people who claim to have seen her acting strangely. Furthermore, the attorney continued, Mrs. Collins has recently made false accusations to federal investigators, demonstrating her inability to distinguish reality from paranoia. She's currently being manipulated by Daniel Blackstone, a business rival of my client who has his own agenda. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she stood slowly, her hand on her belly. Your Honor, everything my husband has presented is either taken out of context or completely fabricated. The recordings you heard were of a woman in distress because her husband was emotionally and financially abusing her. The medical opinions come from a doctor my husband chose, not one I selected myself. But she could see in the judge's eyes that the damage was already done. Marcus's performance had been flawless, and the evidence against her overwhelming. Mrs. Collins, the judge said sternly, the court is deeply concerned about your mental state and your fitness as a parent. I'm ordering a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation and supervised visitation only until, Your Honor. A new voice interrupted from the back of the courtroom. I have evidence that changes everything. Sarah turned to see a young woman with dark hair and determined eyes walking down the aisle. She looked familiar, but Sarah couldn't place her. I'm Dr. Lisa Blackstone, the woman said, and I'm Emma Blackstone's daughter. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Daniel's niece was supposed to be in witness protection, safely hidden from Marcus's reach. Dr. Blackstone, the judge said severely, this is highly irregular. Your Honor, I have digital forensics evidence that proves every piece of documentation presented by Mr. Collins has been fabricated or manipulated. I also have evidence that Mr. Collins murdered my mother 3 years ago to prevent her from exposing his crimes. Marcus's face went white. His lawyers immediately objected. But Lisa continued speaking. I've spent 3 years gathering evidence about my mother's death and Mr. Collins's pattern of abuse. Everything you've seen today, the medical records, the recordings, the witness statements, I can prove they've been falsified. Lisa handed a flash drive to the court clerk. This contains metadata from the audio files, showing they've been edited and spliced together. It contains financial records proving Mr. Collins has been bribing witnesses and paying for false testimony. And it contains my mother's research files, which show that Mr. Collins stole her work before having her killed. The judge called for a recess, and in the chaos that followed, Sarah saw Marcus's carefully constructed facade finally cracking. His lawyers surrounded him, speaking in urgent whispers, while he stared at Lisa with undisguised hatred. But Sarah also saw something else in Marcus's eyes: desperation, and desperate men were capable of anything. As they left the courthouse, Daniel's security team formed a protective circle around Sarah and Lisa. The crowd of reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and in the midst of the chaos, Sarah caught a glimpse of Marcus speaking intently into his phone. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but the expression on his face sent chills down her spine. This wasn't over. If anything, it was about to get much worse. That evening, safe in the Brooklyn house, Sarah finally understood the full scope of what she was up against. Marcus Collins wasn't just an abusive husband, he was a sociopathic predator who had been operating with impunity for years. But now he was cornered, and everyone knew that cornered animals were the most dangerous of all. Sarah's water broke at 3 a.m, 5 weeks early. She woke to sharp pains and the terrifying realization that her body was preparing to deliver her baby in the middle of a war zone. Daniel's security team rushed her to Mount Sinai Hospital, where Dr. Martinez was waiting with a team of specialists. The stress has triggered premature labor, Dr. Martinez explained as they wheeled Sarah into the delivery room. We need to stop this if possible, but if we can't, we're prepared for an early delivery. For the next 8 hours, Sarah fought to keep her baby safely inside her womb, while lawyers battled in courtrooms across the city. The premature labor gave Marcus's legal team new ammunition. Clearly, Sarah's mental instability was endangering the child, but it also revealed the depth of Marcus's depravity. While Sarah lay in the hospital bed, monitors tracking her baby's heartbeat and her own vital signs. Marcus appeared in the hallway with a court order. He'd convinced a different judge to grant him emergency custody, claiming the premature labor was evidence of Sarah's unfitness as a mother. I'm sorry, the head of hospital security told Daniel, but we have to enforce the court order. Mr. Collins has legal custody of the child. Sarah watched through her hospital room window as Marcus set up what could only be described as a command center in the family waiting area. He had lawyers, a private security team, and a court-appointed social worker who would take custody of the baby the moment it was born. He's going to take my baby, Sarah whispered to Daniel, tears streaming down her face. No, Daniel said firmly. He's not. That's when Sarah learned just how far Daniel Blackstone was willing to go to protect her. Daniel made a single phone call, and within an hour, federal agents surrounded the hospital. The SEC investigation had uncovered evidence of Marcus's involvement in international money laundering, which elevated his crimes to federal jurisdiction. The local court order was superseded by federal authority, but Marcus wasn't finished. If he couldn't take the baby legally, he'd find another way. The attack came at sunset. Hospital alarms began blaring as the fire suppression system activated on Sarah's floor. In the chaos that followed, nurses rushing to evacuate patients, visitors fleeing through smoky corridors, Marcus's private security team made their move. They reached Sarah's room just as her baby decided to make its entrance into the world. "Push, Sarah, doctor," Martinez commanded, even as smoke filled the delivery room and shouts echoed in the hallway. Sarah's world narrowed to the primal act of bringing her child into existence. Between contractions, she could hear Daniel and the federal agents in heated confrontation with Marcus's team just outside her door. "This is a federal crime scene," Daniel's voice carried over the alarms. "You have no authority here." "That's my wife and my child," Marcus shouted back. "I have every right." His words were cut off by the sound of the most beautiful cry Sarah had ever heard. Her son entered the world red-faced and furious, his lungs strong despite his early arrival. "He's perfect," Dr. Martinez said, placing the baby on Sarah's chest, small but strong. Through her exhaustion and joy, Sarah heard the commotion in the hallway suddenly stop. A new voice had joined the confrontation, a woman's voice, clear and authoritative. "Marcus Collins, you're under arrest for federal charges of securities fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping." The FBI had arrived. Later, as Sarah held her son in the quiet of the NICU, she learned what had happened. Lisa Blackstone's evidence had been even more damning than anyone realized. The flash drive contained not just proof of Marcus's financial crimes, but recordings of him planning to kidnap the baby if he couldn't get legal custody. The hospital fire had been Marcus's last desperate gambit, a false alarm designed to create chaos while his team took Sarah's child. But Daniel had anticipated the move and had federal agents positioned throughout the hospital. "It's over," Daniel said softly as he stood beside Sarah's bed. "Marcus is in federal custody. The charges will keep him locked up for years." Sarah looked down at her son, who slept peacefully despite everything he'd been born into. "What do we name him?" "Whatever you want. He's your son. Sarah, no one can take him from you now." Sarah thought about everything she'd endured, everything she'd survived, and the strength she'd found in the darkest moments. "Daniel," she said finally. "I want to name him Daniel." The man who had saved them both looked surprised, then deeply moved. "Are you sure? You gave me back my life. It seems fitting that I give you this." Outside the window, New York City glittered in the night, full of possibility and promise. Sarah Collins, who would soon reclaim her maiden name, had survived the worst that one man's cruelty could inflict. Now she was ready to show her son what strength looked like, but even as she savored her victory, Sarah knew that some battles leave scars that never fully heal. Marcus Collins was in prison, but the trauma he'd inflicted would be with her forever. The question now was, what kind of life would she build from the ashes of the old one 6 months later? Sarah Mitchell, she'd legally reclaimed her maiden name, stood at the podium in the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. The same room where Marcus had humiliated her was now filled with supporters, advocates, and survivors who'd come to hear her speak at the first annual Emma Blackstone Foundation Gala. Baby Daniel slept peacefully in his carrier beside the stage, guarded by Kate Morrison and a team of security specialists who'd become like family to Sarah. At 6 months old, he was healthy, curious, and completely unaware that his birth had made headlines around the world. "A year ago," Sarah began, her voice steady and clear, "I stood in this room as a victim. I was isolated, controlled, and convinced that I was powerless to change my circumstances." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Sarah had become something she'd never expected, a symbol of survival, a voice for women who'd been silenced by abuse. "I want to tell you something that my abuser never understood," she continued. "When you try to destroy someone's spirit, you might succeed in breaking them down. But if they survive, they often emerge stronger than they ever were before." The applause was thunderous. But Sarah's attention was drawn to one face in the crowd, Daniel Blackston, who watched her with pride and something deeper that neither of them had yet put into words. Over the past 6 months, Daniel had become her anchor, her advisor, and her dearest friend. He'd helped her rebuild not just her finances and legal standing, but her sense of self-worth. Under his guidance, she'd launched the Emma Blackstone Foundation, dedicated to helping women escape financial abuse and rebuild their independence. The foundation has already helped 200 women leave abusive relationships, Sarah announced to the crowd. We've provided legal support, financial planning, job training, and safe housing. But more than that, we've given them something invaluable, the knowledge that they're not alone. After the gala, Sarah and Daniel walked along the Hudson River, baby Daniel sleeping in his stroller between them. The city lights reflected on the water, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt truly at peace. "You were magnificent tonight," Daniel said softly. "I had a good teacher." Sarah smiled at him. "You taught me that strength isn't about never being afraid, it's about being afraid and doing what's right anyway." They stopped at a bench overlooking the water, and Daniel turned to face her. "Sarah, I need to tell you something." Her heart skipped. Over the months, their friendship had deepened into something neither had expected, but Sarah had been hurt so badly that the idea of trusting another man with her heart seemed impossible. "I know you're not ready," Daniel continued, as if reading her thoughts. "And I know you may never be ready. But I need you to know that what I feel for you isn't gratitude or protectiveness or some savior complex. What is it then? It's love. Real, honest, patient love. The kind that doesn't demand anything in return, that doesn't try to control or possess. I love your strength, your courage, your determination to help others even when you're still healing yourself." Tears filled Sarah's eyes. "Daniel, you don't need to say anything. I just needed you to know that when and if you're ever ready to love again, I'll be here, no matter how long it takes." Sarah looked down at her son, then back at Daniel. This man had risked everything to save her, had asked for nothing in return, had shown her what real love looked like: patient, selfless, and strong. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know, and that's okay. We'll take it as slowly as you need." 3 months later, Marcus Collins was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Sarah attended the hearing, not out of vindictiveness, but because she needed to see justice done. As the bailiff led Marcus away in chains, he caught her eye one last time. The man who had once terrified her now looked small, broken, pathetic. His empire was gone, his reputation destroyed, his freedom taken away. But Sarah felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only relief that he could never hurt another woman. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed with questions. Sarah paused at the top of the steps, her son in her arms and Daniel by her side. "Mrs. Mitchell," one reporter called out, "what's next for you and the foundation?" Sarah looked out at the crowd of cameras and microphones, then at the small group of women who'd come to support her other survivors who'd found their voices through her example. "We're going to keep fighting," she said simply. "For every woman who thinks she's powerless, for every victim who believes she's alone, for every mother who's afraid she can't protect her children, we're going to keep fighting until no one has to suffer in silence." 2 years after that night at the Plaza Hotel, Sarah Mitchell stood in the nursery of her new home, a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights that she'd purchased with money from her book deal and speaking engagements. The room was painted soft yellow, with white furniture and children's books already lining the shelves. 2-year-old Daniel toddled around the room, chattering in the half words that passed for conversation at his age. He was a happy, confident child who'd never known fear or violence, who'd been raised in a home filled with love, laughter, and security. "Mama, look." Daniel held up a wooden block tower he'd built, his face beaming with pride. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Sarah said, kneeling down to admire his architecture. "You're going to be an engineer like Uncle Daniel." The title had evolved naturally over the past year. Daniel Blackstone had become a constant presence in their lives, not as a replacement father figure, but as a family friend who genuinely cared for both Sarah and her son. They'd taken their relationship slowly, building trust day by day, moment by moment. "Speaking of Uncle Daniel," came a voice from the doorway. "He's here to see you." Sarah's housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, smiled as Daniel appeared behind her. He carried a bouquet of daisies, Sarah's favorite flowers, and wore the slightly nervous expression of a man about to ask an important question. Little Daniel abandoned his blocks and ran to hug the man who'd become his favorite person. Daniel scooped him up easily, spinning him around until he giggled. "How's my favorite architect today?" "I builded a castle." "You built a castle," Sarah corrected gently. "And it's magnificent." Mrs. Chen took charge of little Daniel, leading him away for his afternoon snack, leaving Sarah and Daniel alone in the nursery. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, and Sarah couldn't help but think how different this room was from the cold perfection of her old penthouse. This was a home built on love, not control, a place where her son could grow up safe and free. "You look nervous," Sarah observed as Daniel fidgeted with the flowers. "I am nervous." He handed her the daisies, then took her hands in his. "Sarah, these past 2 years have been the best of my life, not because of what we've accomplished or the foundation's success, but because I get to see you becoming the woman you were always meant to be." Sarah's heart began to race. They'd been building toward this moment for months. But she'd been afraid to hope, afraid to believe that happiness this pure could really be hers. "You've taught me what real strength looks like," Daniel continued. "Not the kind that dominates or controls, but the kind that protects and nurtures and lifts others up. You've made me a better man, and I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your love." He dropped to one knee, pulling out a small velvet box. Inside was a simple, solitaire diamond, elegant and understated nothing like the ostentatious jewelry Marcus had bought to show off his wealth. "Sarah Mitchell, will you marry me?" Sarah looked down at this man who'd saved her life in every way that mattered. Daniel had never tried to control her or rush her healing. He'd supported her dreams, celebrated her victories, and held her through the nightmares that still sometimes came. More than that, he'd shown little Daniel what a good man looked like: kind, patient, strong without being dominating. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, I'll marry you." As Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, Sarah heard little Daniel's voice from the kitchen, chattering excitedly to Mrs. Yao Chen about his blocks. This was her family now chosen, built on love, unshakable. The wedding 6 months later was small and perfect. They held it in the garden of the Brooklyn house, surrounded by the women from the foundation, the security team that had become their extended family, and a few close friends who'd supported them through everything. Lisa Blackstone served as maid of honor, while little Daniel was ring bearer, taking his job very seriously as he walked down the aisle with the rings tied to a small pillow. As Sarah walked toward Daniel, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The abuse, the fear, the moment when she'd thought all hope was lost. All of it had led her here. To this man, to this life, to this happiness she'd never dreamed possible. Dearly beloved, the minister began, but Sarah's attention was focused entirely on Daniel's face, on the love and promise she saw there. When they exchanged vows, Sarah spoke from her heart, Daniel, you saved my life, but more than that, you taught me how to save myself. You showed me that love isn't about possession or control. It's about partnership, respect, and the courage to be vulnerable with someone who will never use your trust as a weapon. Daniel's voice was thick with emotion as he responded, Sarah, you took a broken man who thought he understood strength and taught him what real courage looks like. You turned your pain into purpose, your survival into service to others. I promise to spend every day trying to be the man you and Daniel deserve. As they kissed for the first time as husband and wife, Sarah heard little Daniel clapping excitedly in the front row. Her son would grow up in a home filled with love, respect, and the knowledge that real strength came from lifting others up, not tearing them down. The Emma Blackstone Foundation had grown into a national organization, helping thousands of women escape financial abuse and rebuild their lives. Sarah's book, Rising from the Ashes, A Survivor's Guide to Reclaiming Your Life, had become a bestseller and was being adapted into a documentary. But more than any professional success, Sarah treasured the quiet moments, bedtime stories with her son, morning coffee with her husband, the knowledge that she was safe, loved, and free. 5 years after Marcus Collins had tried to destroy her, Sarah Mitchell Blackstone stood in the same Plaza Hotel ballroom, but this time as the keynote speaker for the foundation's annual gala. The room was packed with supporters, survivors, and advocates who joined their mission. They say that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, Sarah said to the crowd. But I want to add something to that. What doesn't kill you can also make you kinder, more compassionate, more determined to prevent others from suffering as you have. In the audience, Daniel held their second child, a daughter they'd named Emma, after his sister. Little Daniel, now 5 years old, sat beside his father, already showing signs of the kindness and strength that would make him proud to carry his father's name. As Sarah finished her speech to thunderous applause, she caught Daniel's eye across the room. He mouthed 3 words that still made her heart skip. I love you. Sarah had learned that surviving wasn't just about enduring, it was about transforming pain into purpose, wounds into wisdom, and fear into the fierce determination to protect others from the same fate. She had risen from the ashes not just to reclaim her own life, but to light the way for others still trapped in the darkness. And that, she realized, was the most powerful revenge of all, not destroying her abuser, but building something beautiful from the ruins he'd tried to create. The little girl who had once believed in fairy tales had grown into a woman who created them not through magic or wishful thinking, but through the hardest work of all the daily choice to love, to trust, to hope, and to help others do the same. In the end, Sarah had discovered something Marcus Collins could never understand. True power wasn't about controlling others, it was about freeing them to become their strongest selves. And in that freedom, everyone won.